Thank you very much for joining this session called Rebooting Leadership Thought. We have 3 sessions today. We start off with Antonio, who's going to talk to us about rebooting with nature, and then Nathan Harter, and then Sarah Chase and Willie Donaldson. So I will, oh, I've got a little thing saying we're spotlighted. I'm spotlighted, that's exciting, isn't it? Yeah, I will switch off my camera and let the spotlight go on Antonio for his talk on rebooting with nature, the need for an epistemological and cultural turn in leadership studies. Over to you, Antonio.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you, Sarah. Thank you to the organizers, and congratulations for this wonderful conference. My name is Antonio Jimenez-Luque, assistant professor in the Department of Leadership Studies at the University of San Diego, California. Before, I was a coordinator of the International Cooperation for Development, the Solidarity Foundation of the University of Barcelona. And today's presentation is a conceptual paper, but it's based on my experience working with indigenous communities and people of African descent in Latin America, and particularly with intercultural and decolonial social movements and grassroots organizations in Colombia, Bolivia, and Brazil. Movements and organizations struggling for environmental issues and cognitive and social justice. And the origin of this paper is in Bristol. In 2019, the International Study Leadership Conference, we had this meeting last second of the conference, and this question emerged. Is critical leadership studies critical enough? So I've been thinking about this, and this presentation is connected. The title of the presentation is Epistemological and Cultural Turn in Leadership, from an Eurocentric conceptualization to a global and intercultural approach. There are many reasons why we should be worried about the current rapid environmental degradation of the world. Among the principal challenges of environmental degradation, we must name global warming due to the increase of greenhouse gas emissions. Besides, other environmental problems also exist, like air and water pollution with industrial waste, oceans filled with large floating waste islands composing a rubbish patch estimated to be twice the size of Texas, drinking water for millions of people contaminated with pesticides, nitrates, and other pollutants from industrialized agriculture, or the destruction of the biodiversity of forests through indiscriminate logging, among others. Regarding our current crisis with coronavirus, it is important to be aware that diseases from remote forests and wildlife infecting human populations have been a constant throughout history. However, because of increasing human intrusion in new natural and not contacted areas, emerging diseases have quadrupled in the last half-century. The current COVID-19 crisis is a warning of what possibly is coming in the future: new pandemics, environmental degradation, more climate changes effects, and other challenges related to an unsustainable Western model of development based on infinite growth. When it comes to the leadership field, we saw world leaders have responded to the crisis differently. Although some leaders have suggested international cooperation and global solidarity to face the pandemic, most of the international leaders decided to take a unilateral approach, blaming other countries and refusing to cooperate for creating a vaccine. Moreover, in spite of the warnings from the World Health Organization, developed countries with economic resources have accumulated the vaccines, while the rest of the world is not having access, which is facilitating the emergence of new variants of the virus. Thus, when a global and multilateral reaction was more needed than ever, this framework of nation states and unilateralism has prevailed to respond to this global and interconnected crisis. In terms of the leadership problematic here, since issues of environmental degradation have global effects and go beyond national borders, they cannot be solved with mainstream leadership approaches from the past that emphasize unilateralism, individualism, competition, and power accumulation in a few hands. What is needed is a more collective approach that distributes power more equitably and fosters multilateralism and cooperation. However, and this is the point in this presentation, A collective and horizontal perspective of leadership will not be enough for these environmental issues, since the causes of these pandemics and climate change are rooted in an idea of Western development and a relationship of domination with nature that is not sustainable. Therefore, one possible solution is a leadership approach that goes beyond Western epistemology, and particularly this ideology of development. This new perspective will combine epistemologies and cultures from all around the world, particularly from traditional communities that have proved for centuries that this relationship of respect for nature is more sustainable for the future generations. So this aims to advocating for an intercultural and interepistemological dialogue between critical perspectives from the North and the South, analyzing collective leadership approaches from indigenous communities in general and the Latin American region in particular regarding environmental issues. For example, in leadership studies, we have gone from mainstream views of great man to relational and complexity theory, systems thinking, process leadership. However, these perspectives need to be complemented. They can be complemented with other ontologies and epistemologies, which are more relational and holistic and see the world in general and the phenomenon of leadership in particular in a more interconnected and interdependent way. Each culture does something called leadership. Culture understands leadership differently. Then it follows that any current leadership theory originating from a single cultural perspective cannot achieve cross-cultural applicability unless it considers the multiple ways of making sense of leadership. In other words, it is not enough to include other leadership approaches such as indigenous leadership, African leadership, Asian leadership, and so on, if such theories are not at the level of existing mainstream theory. Boaventura de Sousa Santos, a Portuguese sociologist, he says, what cannot be said or said clearly in one language or culture may be said and said clearly in another language or culture. Acknowledging other kinds of knowledge and other partners in the conversation for other kinds of conversation opens the field for infinite discursive and non-discursive exchanges with unfathomable codifications and horizontalities. Then, besides a critical leadership approach, what is needed again is this broader perspective of leadership regarding epistemologies and cultures. A broader approach should avoid viewing non-Western epistemologies as myths and non-Western cultures as folklore. Rather, other epistemological projects and cultures should be viewed as valid ways of leading and organizing economic, political, and social projects that go beyond those proposed by a predominantly Western worldview. And as an example, and focusing on environmental issues, we are going to analyze the good living, or buen vivir, as an economic model of development, political project, and social movement that goes beyond Western epistemology. The buen vivir is a worldview proposal that celebrates different ways of living, valuing diversity from the lenses of interculturality, multinationality, and political pluralism. A system that emphasizes the self-sufficiency and self-management of living in a community. A system that does not consider having the quality of life or well-being depending solely on the possession of material goods or income levels. A system that recognizes the importance given to exploring happiness and good spiritual living. Different sectors of society engage in political and communitarian work, listening to each other, thinking together, and working together in search of new ways of living amid polarities within ideologies and political goals. The buen vivir criticizes the inequalities prevenient from capitalism, while presenting associative and cooperative proposals. The thought of the buen vivir inspires political leadership and social movements in Latin America and across the world. Various collective and community organizations in Latin America and also around the world have been adopting the buen vivir to rescue the memory and practices of indigenous peoples. Indigenous and Afro-descendants people has been the protagonists in organizing community processes to develop leadership capacity and promote and mobilize actions that emphasize the buen vivir. As I said before, part of the idea of this presentation is advocating for this intercultural dialogue between global North and South. But we need to be aware that social relationships are power relationships, Then when it comes to processes of communication, all these power relationships are manifested too. In other words, the interlocutors are not always at even conditions, sometimes violently or sometimes subtly. That is why when we start intercultural communication, we need to establish the basis for the process before starting. We need to create the evenest conditions possible, identifying the power positions of every interlocutor and trying to balance them. Furthermore, to do so, neither paternalism nor being victimized are appropriate attitudes to start intercultural communication. Therefore, it is key that before starting an intercultural dialogue between the global North and South, we need to be aware of the context of power relations where the dialogue is exercised and a colonial past of epistemicide. Otherwise, as the history of the world has shown in the last centuries, the much needed true dialogue will become another monologue imposed by the dominant social group. This is why today social movements and indigenous organizations involved with this project of RoomB are struggling to build power and balancing asymmetries of power in order to have a dialogue and not a monologue. So the idea is that from this true intercultural dialogue will emerge a global and intercultural approach, which will result of the combination of critical leadership perspectives from the North, critical leadership perspective from the South, and epistemologies from the North and the South. And this intercultural, global and intercultural approach is aware of an interconnected and interdependent world, values other epistemologies and cultures, acknowledges asymmetries of power when it comes to cultures and epistemological perspectives, facilitates spaces to include the conceptualizations and leadership approaches of different worldviews and ways of being, and puts the focus on intercultural dialogue and communication that transforms the world. Additionally, this global and intercultural approach has a holistic perspective of a fluid world that is relational and constantly in movement, understand the complexity and ambiguity of human relationships in general, particularly related to different cultures, knowledge, and meanings. And finally, unfolds a process of sense-making regarding our relationship with the Earth that goes from seeing the planet as a resource to be exploited to a conceptualization of the Earth as our mother, this idea of Pachamama, who needs to be respected and preserved for the future generations. In essence, individualistic, leader-centered, and power-accumulated mainstream approaches from the global North are not suited to deal with the new global environmental challenge that the world is facing. Thus, a new conceptualization of leadership beyond the Western canon is needed. Since the world cannot be explained just from the global North perspective, and neither from just the global South view, a new and more holistic conceptualization must emerge from an intercultural dialogue of leadership approaches and epistemologies between the global North and the South. Like the crisis in 1973 that changed the narrative from management to leadership, today's pandemic might be the kind of disruptive force that triggers a reset in our ways of thinking about leadership, leaders, and leadership practices. And to do so, again, an intercultural dialogue between the global North and South becomes central. So in conclusion, this global and intercultural approach of leadership will facilitate the design of a pluriversal world better suited to face the new challenges that the Earth is facing and the new ones that are coming. Of course, the endeavor is immense, and we have already started running out of time. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Antonio. There's a lot to think about, and a lot of issues that you raised. And I'm looking. Sarah, you've switched on your camera. Have you got a question?
Well, I have a comment. I'm very interested in what you spoke about, Antonio. And I missed some of it because it went a little fast, and I'm a visual learner. But I think what you're saying, a lot of us kind of intuitively know that things have to change, and that the pandemic has spawned that recognition. It's like a reckoning time of how we relate to each other. Do you ever consider the Kuhn's notion of paradigm shift, like as a lens on what needs to happen?
That's an excellent question. And I totally agree. I believe we are right now, we are in this paradigm, in this moment of paradigm change. I think we are transitioning from a late modernity, post-modernity to a new paradigm. And that's why, you see politicians, even us as scholars, we don't know what is coming, and we are kind of struggling there. But I love that you use the word intuition, because intuition is something very important. And sometimes it's not, when we talk about intuition or even emotions, it's not valued from this very rational perspective that you need to measure everything on intuition or emotions. But intuitions and emotions are a way of knowing. It's a different epistemology. And I think we have this intuition that something is changing. We don't know where are we going, but we are aware that something is changing. So this idea of Kuhn's changing of paradigms is there. And I think with these conversations and dialogues, we are going there, even if it's difficult.
Thank you. And Willie, you switched on your camera. Do you have a question?
A question and an observation, Antonio, and it's great to see you in person. We've corresponded on the prior issue, but I've written about, and I would pose to you, which becomes more powerful? Is it followership or leadership? If we have followers who are demanding leaders make the changes you're talking about, it seems to me that's where the power lies. So I'd just be curious to get your take on that.
Yes, I totally agree, and nice to see you in person. Leadership is this relational process, leaders and followers, what is happening in between. But when it comes to our democracies and democratic systems, it's all about the followers, because the followers are giving their sovereignty to the representatives, and then they forget about this. And then the representatives, the leaders, they do whatever they want. Sometimes we see followers voting these toxic and narcissist leaders, and without any critical thinking. So I believe that in leadership studies, we should talk more about followers, because the responsibility is huge in general, and particularly for democracy. To have a healthy democracy, we need to focus more on followers.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Antonio. Fidel, you switched on your mic, so I guess you've got a question.
Yes, I do, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you, Antonio. Two things I want two issues I would like to raise, and I would like to hear your reflections on them. One is you are talking about this whole idea of the North talking to the South. So you are bringing in interculturalism, intercultural dialogue, and so forth. And then I'm just looking at it now from the Northern perspective. If you are not having intercultural dialogue in the context of leadership where we are, how are you going to engage with intercultural dialogue in a context where we are not? I.e., how do we deal with the sort of the dynamics happening in the Western societies in the North as we prepare ourselves for this transition, epistemological change you are talking about? So I'm intrigued. You might have some ideas.
That's an excellent question, because I think that's the key. Personally, I'm interested in this intercultural dialogue, but as I said, I think the key is to acknowledge the asymmetries of power that resulted from socio-historical factors, colonialism, for example. So without acknowledging this, even if we try to have this intercultural dialogue, many times what we are reproducing is this monologue from the most powerful social group. And when I was involved with the international cooperation at the University of Barcelona, I saw this many times. Having all these projects of international cooperation cooperation all around the world, and with good intentions, imposing, you know, a monologue and reproducing the status quo. So I think the key is leveraging power asymmetries, balancing asymmetries of power, and I think this is a global social movement from below. That is already there and it's growing, and also people like us with the privilege of being in the academy and having these platforms, you know, pushing from our platforms. I think this is key, because otherwise we are gonna see this monologue all the time. And with the coronavirus, we saw what is happening. Powerful, rich countries, they are distributing the vaccines, but what about the global south? And we are not approaching this as a global community, but still with the nation state approach and based on this, reproducing these asymmetries of power. So I think to balance is gonna come from bottom up, and I focus on this social movement of buen vivir, good living, and there are other transnational global social movements very important there. And today we have all this network with different organizations, and I think the future is there in social movements pushing from bottom up, and again allies from Western universities, organizations, and so on. It's a very good question, but it's a very difficult one.
Thank you. I mean, you are reminding me of South Africa and what happened with Omicron when they have those technological advances. What they get in exchange is punishment. Will stop the flight rather than thanking them for identifying a new variant of COVID, if you see what I mean. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you, Antonio, for engaging that question. And Chi, I see you switched on your camera and mic. There you go.
Hello, Antonio. Thank you so much for your very, very insightful speech. And I just have one question, and maybe, you know, sometimes it's a little, technology is a little bit not that stable, so I cannot hear you sometimes very well. But anyway, I really like your idea of this, you know, holistic worldview, incorporating the South and the North voices into solving all this kind of world problems. I'm thinking in the past, I'm always thinking, you know, talking about incorporating the East and West worldview. And right now you expand it in the South, and you know, you put power into this kind of a, you know, construct. This is very interesting. I'm thinking about for the environmental issues, of course, it's very complicated. It's not just the environment problem, right? It's the inequality and the political problem, economic problem, and all those problems. And in the Western, you know, kind of leadership recently, in recent years, I think we really embrace this system thinking, adaptive leadership a lot, which, you know, these two theories, or I don't know what should I call theories or something else, but these are very, very great theories. However, I'm also thinking about, you know, in the lots of traditional societies, particularly in the South, and there are lots of societies which probably the history started from system thinking, holistic thinking, and this history started to, you know, with the practice of adaptive leadership. It's just their adaptive leadership and our adaptive leadership probably have, you know, can complement each other, strengthen each other, enrich each other. Their system thinking can, you know, enhance our system thinking. Their system thinking can really enrich our system thinking. I'm wondering, you know, because we are working in the leadership field, and particularly, you know, I'm in the global leadership. I'm thinking about, is there any way, you know, leadership should embrace the world, right? If we're solving the world problem, is that sensitive to use the only the Western system thinking and the Western adaptive leadership to approach? For example, if I want to study Chinese leadership and Chinese environmental issue, and of course it has a lot to do with the Western system thinking, Western adaptive leadership, but is that enough? And China has, Taoism and all those kind of isms, which speaks a lot about system thinking, holistic thinking, adaptive leadership. So I'm just curious about what thoughts you have on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and that's a wonderful, explanation of what is going on, because that's why it's important to bring power to the conversation, because we see how what has been a local view, let's say European or North America, has been imposed as a universal perspective. And as I said before, we cannot explain the world just from a Western perspective, and we cannot explain the world just from a non-Western perspective. To understand the world, we need to approach it in a holistic way, with a dialogue between all different perspectives, and that's why power is very important. For example, studying in indigenous communities, indigenous leadership, we see these ideas of how important is the context, how important is the relational approach. But it's funny because they have been talking about this forever. As you were saying, pre-modern societies, traditional societies, they have been talking about this. And we needed to start with great men theory and go through a long process of leadership until we started to talk about relational leadership, leadership as practice, and adaptive leadership. And then studying traditional communities, we see they have been doing this forever. So that's why we need to be a little bit more humble and understand that what we bring to the conversation is very important, but it's not universal, or it's not the only approach to understand leadership. And there are a lot of interesting approaches to understand leadership out there that we need to situate at the same level. Because, for example, if you have a look to leadership books, you have leadership here, which is basically mainstream, and then a subordinated position, women and leadership, indigenous leadership, African leadership. So it's like something exceptional, but always, on the top is the leadership, the norm, which is mainstream Western leadership. So we need to put all these leadership views, perspective, approaches at the same level and have a true dialogue if we really want to know more about this fascinating phenomenon of leadership.
Brilliant, thank you. I might have missed it because I say there's your it's not very stable, your screen, but I was just wondering, if you could wave a magic wand to have all this, intercultural dialogue and things that you were talking about, what would be the outcome of your waving your magic wand?
Yes, here I did the exercise of trying to think how this global and intercultural leadership approach looks like. And I think it's an approach where we understand the world as more holistic, more interconnected, more interdependent, and then the asymmetries of power are less hierarchical, because probably asymmetries of power they are going to exist always, but we need to try to balance them.
And I guess more, what's the practical one, maybe not the magical one? How is that going to happen in practice? I guess that's more what I mean.
In practice, yes. In practice, what the social movements they are doing, they are trying to balance power, empowering themselves. Creating these networks, having allies from the south and the north, and gaining momentum to be able to have this dialogue. For example, we have the examples of Ecuador and Bolivia with the constitutions. Indigenous communities, they included this idea of good living in the constitutions. Then we have seen the problems they have had later, because still the model of development is very based on growth and exploitation of natural resources, but they were able to gain momentum, leverage power, and include this perspective into the political constitution. This is an example. And then in other countries, they are having like these movements, cooperatives, and commons, for example. So it's little steps, but trying to do little steps everywhere and creating networks and raising and building power. That's what we need to do.
Brilliant. I see Nathan, we've got 1 minute left. Nathan, you switched on your mic. If you have got a question for Antonio or comment.
No, just preparing for my turn.
Okay, that's brilliant.
Happy to let him have his full time.
So, thank you very much, Antonio, for that very thought-provoking talk. Thank you for joining us, even though you're not at home, but it sounds like you're somewhere nice and stayed in Barcelona. So thank you very much, Antonio. And